That poor tiny girl uncovers a hidden bomb in a birthday cake. A millionaire at the party is shocked. But just when they think the worst is over, something terrible happens. Rate my story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. 4-year-old Juniper's scream sliced through the afternoon air like a shard of glass, echoing across the cobblestone streets of the historic district. Archibald, 52, nearly spilled his coffee as he stepped away from the window of his luxurious apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the weather-beaten colonial house across the street, a 2-story, yellow-painted building with peeling blue window frames that stood in stark contrast to the sleek modernity of his building. As the owner of one of the largest construction firms in the region, Archibald was used to solving complex problems, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone since he lost Vivian on a rainy night. Across the street, inside the colonial house, Leona curled up in the corner of the kitchen, her 4 years insufficient to understand why her Aunt Bernice hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman held a metal spoon she had heated on the wood-burning stove, her eyes bloodshot from the alcohol, fixed on the girl trembling before her. "You're a curse on this house," Bernice hissed, her voice slurred from the moonshine she'd been drinking since noon. "Because of you, my sister's gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on Leona's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin limbs. Leona bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screams only enraged her aunt more, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother, Willow's, soft voice singing that lullaby before bedtime. It was all that was left of her now. Fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind in the most painful moments. Willow had built a small nest egg working as a secretary, saving every penny to secure her daughter's future, but it was all lost when she passed. "Stop whining," Bernice grunted, putting the spoon away in the cupboard. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow, and if you get charcoal on the walls again, you'll see what real punishment is." Leona ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song quietly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. Archibald stopped reviewing contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. Vivian used to sing it when she was cooking, a folk song about free birds. He went to the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the colonial house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that child's voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, Archibald felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. His wealth, built through investments in stocks and real estate, had always brought him comfort, but it had never filled the void left by Vivian. His businesses thrived. His investments yielded substantial dividends, but none of it mattered when loneliness consumed him in the silent mornings. In the house next door to the colonial one, Maristella, a 61-year-old retired teacher, was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike Archibald, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years of teaching in elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress. "That's odd," she thought, watching the windows of the house. Bernice had always been troubled, but since she took custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran in the streets like the other children in town. Meanwhile, Archibald remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The song had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of Willow, his former employee who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before Vivian's accident. Willow was a gentle woman, always humming as she organized the construction company's files. Then suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again, until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains when Leona finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers gripped the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, Archibald closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that maybe it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell on the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running away from his responsibilities, and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore a child suffering. The next morning brought the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical activity of the town, awakening for another day. Maristella put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something about that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the colonial house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. Bernice opened the door with a puffy face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning, Bernice," Maristella said with her gentlest smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a good chat." Bernice hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Maristella, It's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." Maristella took a step forward, forcing Bernice to back away. "And I'd love to meet your niece. I heard she's a lovely little girl." Bernice's face hardened for an instant before forcing a weak smile. "Leona is sick. High fever. Best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. Maristella pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," the teacher insisted. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 kids. You know how it is." "No need, no," Bernice answered quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a cold. It'll pass soon." Maristella noticed Bernice's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, Archibald watched the scene from his window while he had breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams where a child's voice mingled with memories of Willow. When he saw Maristella at the door of the colonial house, a strange curiosity swept over him. The teacher finally said goodbye to Bernice, but not before casting an investigative glance into the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. Inside the colonial house, Bernice slammed the door shut and went to the kitchen, where she found Leona crouched behind the table, trying to hide. The girl had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" Bernice growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Auntie," Leona murmured, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" Bernice laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the backyard, and since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." Leona went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single apple tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the wood-burning stove. It was always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. The hours passed slowly. Bernice had locked the back door, leaving Leona in the yard under the hot midday sun. The girl began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum her mother's song quietly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was that melody that reached Archibald's ears again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. Willow would hum that same song while she worked. Willow, who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. Willow, who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named Leona, Archibald murmured, his cell phone shaking in his hands. Willow's daughter was named Leona. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the gentle woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made this connection before? Archibald put away his cell phone and began to walk back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered Willow mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with Vivienne, the problems in the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now 5 years later, Willow's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt that Archibald carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped Willow when she clearly needed it. His considerable fortune, built through careful investments in stocks and real estate funds, had always brought him financial security. He had rental apartments that generated passive income, investments in Bitcoin that had appreciated exponentially, and a net worth that grew constantly. But what good was all this capital if he couldn't use it to help when needed? At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, punctually, the screams started again. This time, Archibald didn't step away from the window. He watched with growing horror as, through the kitchen window of the colonial house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and started recording, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. Bernice was holding something in her hands, it seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently in the direction of a small figure that he could barely distinguish. Leona's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time Archibald couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? His hands trembled as he looked at his cell phone. There was the evidence of what he suspected. But there was also the responsibility to act, something he had avoided for years since the loss of Vivienne. This time, however, it wasn't just about him. It was about an innocent child who needed help. That night, Leona slept on the floor of the backyard, where Bernice had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The girl curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would get her out of that place of pain. Across the street, Archibald couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since Vivienne's departure. The money in his bank accounts, the profits from his ventures, none of it mattered if he continued to be just a silent observer of other people's suffering. 3 days had passed since Archibald discovered the child's identity, and the guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During these days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 in the afternoon, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost Vivienne. On that Thursday morning, Maristella made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the colonial house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit to Bernice, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from which she had the best view of the backyard of the colonial house. What she saw horrified her. Leona was sitting under the apple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The girl was drawing on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that Maristella recognized as birds. "My God," whispered the teacher, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. Leona looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to Maristella's surprise, the girl smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved timidly. "Hi, Grandma," Leona said in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, darling," Maristella replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you all right?" Leona looked quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "How lovely. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," the girl replied, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke Maristella's heart. At that moment, Bernice's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Leona, where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything Maristella needed to know. Leona got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at Maristella with an expression that screamed for help. Maristella remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to her aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, Archibald had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the Santos's backyard partially, and the sight of the marks on Leona's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine fury burning in his chest. Willow had trusted him in some way. Even indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. His financial investments continued to generate substantial dividends. His investments in real estate funds thrived, and his wealth grew constantly. He had enough money to solve any problem, but he couldn't find the courage to pick up a simple telephone to call the authorities. At 11 in the morning, Maristella made a courageous decision. She put on her best Sunday dress, took a tray of homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and went back to the colonial house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. Bernice answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "Mrs. Maristella, I already told you it's not a good time." "Bernice, dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," Maristella interrupted firmly, "and I insist on getting to know little Leona better. As old neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before Bernice could protest, Maristela had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the colonial house was dark and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "Leona is sleeping," Bernice lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "That's a shame." "Maybe another time then," Maristela said, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that appeared to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. Maristela and Bernice froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "It must be the neighbor's cat," Bernice said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. Maristela smiled and nodded, but had decided she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But Bernice, remember that I'm always here next door if you need anything at all." Maristela's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the teacher left, Bernice locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found Leona curled up behind the wood-burning stove, trying to hide. The girl had cried when she heard Maristela's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," Bernice accused, her eyes already gleaming with familiar fury. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," Leona protested, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. Bernice took the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. Leona recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to get attention, don't you?" Bernice hissed as the spoon heated up. "Want the neighbors to come here asking questions? Think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, Archibald had positioned his cell phone at the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. Willow had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. This child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. All his financial resources, his passive income from rentals, his business profits, none of it had meaning if he couldn't protect an innocent child. As Leona suffered another episode of systematic torture, Archibald made a call he hadn't made in months. He called Finley, his personal lawyer and old college friend. "Finley, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as Leona's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it might be a matter of life." The lawyer's voice turned serious immediately. "Archibald, tell me everything. If it's about a child in danger, we can't waste any time." That night, after Bernice fell asleep drunk on the living room couch, Leona managed to slip silently into the backyard. Her new burns were stinging, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the apple tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. Across the street, Archibald spent the night awake, planning how to use all his wealth and influence to save the daughter of the woman he had failed to help years ago. Finley arrived at Archibald's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been classmates at university nearly 3 decades ago, and Finley knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "Archibald, I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," Finley said, sitting in the apartment's spacious living room. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details. Archibald poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine, Willow. She's being mistreated by the aunt who's taking care of her. Mistreated how? Finley asked, taking a notepad out of his briefcase. Burns, daily screams. Neglect. Archibald paused, struggling with the words. I have recordings, Finley, evidence of what's happening. Finley was silent for a moment, processing the information. Archibald, this is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately. I know, Archibald replied, running his hands over his face. But there's something else. Willow worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before Vivian's accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible, Finley finished, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. Archibald nodded. His considerable fortune, accumulated through smart investments in stocks and real estate, had always allowed him to solve problems with money. But this time it wasn't an issue that could be resolved simply by transferring funds between bank accounts. At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and Finley could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. This happens every day, he asked, horrified. At 3 in the afternoon, religiously, but sometimes at other times too, Archibald replied, picking up his cell phone. Want to see the recordings? Finley watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something about the systematization of that violence deeply disturbed him. Archibald, we can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately. While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, Leona was living through another day of terror. Bernice had woken up with a particularly bad hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that Leona had made on the kitchen wall during the night. How many times do I have to tell you not to mess up the walls? Bernice yelled, grabbing Leona's arm hard enough to leave marks. You're a plague, a curse on this house. Leona tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you, Bernice continued, pushing the girl down the hallway. And if I hear a single noise, you'll experience a punishment you've never experienced before. The room where Leona was locked was small and stuffy, with only one high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to hum her mother's song quietly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was that song that Maristella heard when she passed by the house at noon. The retired teacher had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with Leona in the yard, the mark she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. Maristella stopped in front of the gate and listened. Leona's voice was weak, but laden with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing her walk, Maristella went directly to the town centre, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the caseworker, Hazel, well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. Hazel, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation, Maristella said, entering the office without ceremony. Hazel looked up from the papers she was analyzing. Mrs. Maristella, good to see you. What brings you here today? A child in danger. My neighbor, I'm sure she's being mistreated. Hazel straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a caseworker, She had learned to recognize when a report was serious, and Maristella was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," Hazel said, picking up a complaint form. While Maristella was reporting her observations across town, Finley was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. District Attorney Noah listened attentively as Finley presented the evidence collected by Archibald. "This is compelling evidence," said the DA, examining the videos on Finley's cell phone. "I'm going to order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" Finley asked, worried. "With this evidence, we can act today," Noah replied. "I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now." By an extraordinary coincidence, 2 simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. Hazel was finishing writing down Maristella's account when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services," Hazel speaking. "Hazel, this is DA Noah. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house on Cobblestone Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse." Hazel paused, her pen suspended over the paper. "Is it number 127 by any chance? Yellow Colonial House?" "That's right." "How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," Hazel replied, looking at Maristella with surprise. "2 independent sources. This confirms the severity of the situation." At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. Hazel, accompanied by 2 social workers and a sheriff's deputy, was heading to the Santos's house. Maristella had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. Archibald watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Finley was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change Leona's life forever. "You did the right thing," Finley said, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," Archibald replied, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the colonial house. In the house, Bernice had gone out to buy alcohol at the liquor store, leaving Leona locked in the stuffy room. The girl continued to sing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When Hazel knocked on the door of the colonial house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was Maristella who first heard the faint voice coming from the room in the back. "Someone's here," she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the door to the room and found Leona curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their hearts. The girl looked up with wide and frightened eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, darling," said Hazel, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Hazel. We've come to help you." Leona looked at Maristella, recognizing the gentle lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by fear. "Auntie Bernice will be angry," she whispered. "You don't have to worry about that now," Maristella said, reaching out to the girl. "We're going to leave here, okay?" Leona's departure from the colonial house was a moment that would be engraved in the memory of everyone present. The girl firmly held Maristella's hand, her steps small and hesitant as she crossed the door that had been her prison for so many months. Across the street, Archibald felt tears welling up in his eyes for the first time in 5 years. He had managed to do something that mattered, something that honored the memory of Willow and in some way also that of Vivienne. In the months that followed, an extraordinary transformation happened. Leona was temporarily placed in the care of Maristella, who volunteered as a foster family. Archibald, using a considerable portion of his wealth, established an educational fund for the girl and other children in similar situations. Bernice was referred for treatment for alcoholism, finally facing her own demons that had turned her into someone cruel. The process was long and painful, but necessary. 6 months later, on a sunny afternoon, Leona was playing in Maristella's backyard when she heard a familiar song coming from the house across the street. It was Archibald, playing on the piano the same melody she hummed, the song that her mother used to sing. The girl ran to the fence and waved to the man who had been instrumental in her salvation. Archibald waved back, a genuine smile lighting up his face for the first time in years. At that moment, he understood that all his fortune, all his investments in stocks and funds, only had true value when used to make a difference in someone's life. And Leona, now strong and smiling, was living proof that love and courage can transform even the most desperate situations into stories of hope and new beginnings. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving a score from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.